Hello everybody and welcome to today's EAZA Animal Welfare webinar. And firstly, I'd like to thank the International Fund for Animal Welfare for sponsoring these sessions, ensuring that they are freely available for all to join. So welcome to today's session. My name's Sally Binding, I'm the EAZA Animal Welfare Coordinator, and I'm joined by my colleague Sandra Camus, who's the EAZA Communications Officer, and she's on tech assistance today. So if you have any problems at all, she'll leave her details in the chat. She'll be monitoring the chat. Please do contact her and hopefully she will be able to sort things out for you. Please do keep your microphones on mute, but enable your chat function if you have any questions throughout the session, and any questions specifically for our speaker. Please do put them in the chat function. I'll be monitoring that and collating all the questions. And then we do have a Q&A session at the end. So please ask your questions as the webinar proceeds. Just to let you know, the webinar is recorded and it will be available via EAZA's YouTube channel. And you can access that either directly or through our EAZA website page, the animal welfare section. And there you'll find all previous recordings of webinars. So please do check that out. You're very welcome to watch them, download and share. And we do welcome everybody to do that. On our EAZA website welfare page, you'll also find an animal welfare assessments library, which I would encourage you to have a look at. Lots of assessments and guidance which have been shared by various institutions, including EAZA members, and they are all free for you to download and use as you would like. So I would like to welcome today, it's our great honour to have Dr. Sally Sherwen, who is the Director of Wildlife Conservation and Science at Zoos Victoria, joining us today. The Zoos Victoria is the conservation organisation that oversees 3 major zoos in Australia. And Sally leads a dynamic team of scientists and specialists, and they develop and deliver strategic programmes in conservation, animal welfare, education and environmental sustainability throughout their organisation. She has a PhD in animal welfare science, and in previous roles she established evidence-based research programmes in animal behaviour and welfare science, and she developed and implemented institutional welfare assessment tool and ran collaborative training sessions with several NGOs for industry professionals. And it's particularly the animal welfare assessments tool, which is well known in the zoos industry as a leading force. Sally is a member of the Animal Welfare Advisory Committee for the Victorian Government, where she acts as one of the state's 8 expert scientists charged with advising the government on animal welfare issues that arise, not just within the zoo industry, but also farm and pets and wildlife. So it is my great honour to hand the floor to you, Sally. Thank you very much, and very much looking forward to your session.
Thank you, Sal, and thank you everyone for joining today from wherever around the world you guys are. It's evening here in Melbourne, and yeah, just apologies if the light changes on me, or if you think something is happening with the camera. There's the sun setting. So I just want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today. For me, it's in Melbourne here, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I also just want to take a minute to acknowledge, particularly around the world, what we're all going through, but especially I know a lot of you guys are in Europe at the moment, and we're watching the news very closely and feeling for what you guys are going through as individuals, and also particularly the zoo industry. I know it's been really hard hit. So I really appreciate the time that you're taking out to have these conversations, and just rest assured we're thinking of you, this global zoo community, and all here for each other when if you need any support, just reach out. So I'm going to talk today about one key message, if everyone can walk away from today with, is just the importance of multidisciplinary approaches to zoo-based conservation work. And so I'm going to talk theoretically about some of the broad or the really key disciplines of science that are relevant to Sorry, did I cut out for a little bit there, I think?
You're back, we're good.
Oh, great. Sorry about that. So 3 broad disciplines that's relevant to our work, and talk through some of the sciences and some of the breakthroughs and progress that can be made when we use them together as a collective and see them as complementary, not competing with each other. And so that'll be the focus of today. And I'm going to use an example of some work that we've been doing recently where this has been really front and center for us. And it's drawing on, it's actually animal welfare applied from our learnings from working within the zoo for zoo animals, applying that to wildlife and some of the work we're doing there. So it is a little bit different to the normal focus on the zoo collection animals, but it's all completely transferable and relevant in how we consider and conceptualize what we do as a sector. So I hope that makes sense, and yeah, and we can chat more in the questions if you want some more zoo specific examples other than the wildlife work that I'll talk about. So the first thing I think we all need to start to get really comfortable with is the importance of transformation. And this can come from reflection, thinking about your learning experiences, and focus really on the future and where we want to be, what we think we should live by, and then map out the path to get there. So I think that's so critical for our industry in particular, that we are really focused on always improving, looking at what we can do differently, and that transformation being, you know, a key focus for us. And, you know, a lot of the animals that we work with do actually have some pretty extreme transformations in their life cycle, and without a doubt we should look to them and get some inspiration of how we can look at what we do and transform in a way that's relevant to society and the challenges that are being faced. So with that in mind, I thought let's just do a bit of a recap of where things are at and where we've been historically as a sector. And I'm using some Zoos Victoria examples of part of our journey, but I think this would be relatively similar for a whole range of other zoos as well. So hopefully you can see some parallels with your institution as well. So if we think about mapping conservation gain and animal welfare benefits on each axis of a graph, and plot different parts of where we've come from and where we're going, the first one to acknowledge is, you know, the historical concept that animals were kept in zoos for entertainment purpose. So for humans as the focus and animals as there for human benefit. And the zoo enclosures obviously were designed really for visibility and not really considering animal welfare or conservation in that space. Then you move slightly forward, a little bit higher up the conservation gain scale and a little bit higher down the animal welfare benefits end, and animals still working as entertainers, but there's greater consideration of biological functioning. So this just means the need to keep animals alive. Again, you'd question the motivation behind that to potentially be more about the benefits to zoos of cost savings if you have more animals alive, for example. So obviously quite a space that we've moved away from. And then there's this bigger jump up the conservation scale and across the animal welfare benefit as well. We're getting closer to a more desirable space where conservation and education were introduced as part of the zoo. And we started to consider more how we can do certain zoo practices, but without harming animals in the process. So still the focus here isn't on thriving animals or positive animal welfare. It's still very much on just what can we do and not harm animals, which is a big step forward from those previous two examples, but not quite where really, progressive thinking would be at that time. Next big jump is where zoos started to take the conservation space more seriously. So our skills and expertise as an industry started to be applied in this field of conservation. So the establishment of conservation breeding programs or captive breeding programs and in situ support for certain programs. So introducing research as well into zoo animal welfare and consideration of enrichment and behaviour programs starting to become widespread, as well as animal training to support a lot of animal welfare outcomes. So you can see this is really nudging up towards conservation and animal welfare gain and benefits in this space. Well, we've still got more to do and further progress to be made. I'd say the next jump, and you'll notice as well, I should have said these points aren't in a nice, neat, linear relationship, because if we plot against what is really having the conservation benefits and the animal welfare benefits, it's definitely not a linear relationship, but it's pretty close to. So there's the next stage is about really integrating evidence-based management, the phasing out of what we'd call harmful activities that aren't aligned with conservation. So taking a good hard look at all of the various zoo activities that can happen and evaluate, what's the motivation behind them, how they're contributing to a conservation mission of the zoo. And then introducing social science as a new discipline. And in terms of social science, we're referring to here the study of human behaviour and attitudes, and how some of those campaigns can be used to drive conservation outcomes, given so many of the threats to the wildlife that we're all working for are human driven. So that was another huge step in the right direction. And I'd say we all, our various zoo industries might be at various stages along this. This isn't an exhaustive list of examples, but I think it's quite handy for us to conceptualize this and plot where we think we are. And the last one I just wanted to flag, which obviously isn't the last one or won't be the last one in the zoo industry's lifespan, but it's really moving to a space where we need to start really considering as animals coming first and being the key priority for what we do. And this means really carefully refined species selection, being mindful of what animals that we commit to caring for, focusing again way beyond just that concept where we were just there to prevent harm and make sure that they're not suffering. We are now in a space where that's the absolute, just without question, a bare minimum. But what we need to do is focus on thriving animals and positive animal welfare, and completely change our consideration of what is an appropriate zoo activity by thinking through what can we do that benefits both conservation and the individual animal welfare in our care. So that's, I think, something that everyone's working towards as much as possible. I'm not sure that that anyone's really achieved that stage yet, but hopefully it's a pretty desirable goal that we can all be striving towards. And I know we are absolutely on that path as an organisation. So this is the stuff that we do absolutely want to move away from, anything that is not contributing to conservation but also has poor animal welfare outcomes. And this space is where we all want to be, but obviously further up that in that top corner there, where we are seeing key conservation outcomes and benefits and key animal welfare benefits. Now, having said that, some activities we engage in aren't as clear-cut as fitting, along this line here. So there's an example of some of the work that we all do, a lot of us do, in terms of rescuing animals. So rescued wildlife, and I put non-threatened wildlife in there because of differentiating between that and key conservation breeding programs. So I'll give a few examples of this, that what we do for koalas, for example, in Victoria aren't a threatened species, but we still do what we can to prevent suffering in these wild animals. And that's an animal welfare activity, not necessarily a conservation outcome as a result of that, but still absolutely worthwhile. And we'll talk a bit more about that. Then there's some activities really high on the conservation gain or benefit scale, but potentially some challenges in managing animal welfare, and really difficult decisions do sometimes have to be made and risk weighed up. So the key for these activities that don't necessarily fit in either the clear-cut green or red areas, so green for encouraging those activities, red for discouraging those activities, is really thinking about what can we do to shift them into this green space a bit more. So what can we do for intensive conservation breeding programs if we've got some welfare concerns, for example, in how they're run? What can we do to integrate the welfare science and thinking more integrated into those programs and shift it further across that scale? And this is part of why it's so important for us to be blending the learnings from these different sciences. And, you know, for this rescued work for wildlife, how do we give it more of a conservation profile and turn it into something that can actually have a really powerful conservation message associated with it as well? And so we should be thinking about how do we pair that rescued wildlife animal welfare activity with messages around conservation to further increase that gain there. So that's, I think, a useful activity for all of us, again, that focusing on the transformation, the need for us to reflect and consider where we've been and where we're going, where we want to be, and what we can do to tweak certain activities that we see value in and to move them into that more high conservation gain, high animal welfare space. And it's quite a useful exercise. I'd encourage you guys all to start, you know, doing a bit of a conceptual plot of some activities at your various institutions on this as well. It can help really refine how we do things. So now talking a bit more specifically about some of the sciences. So at Zoos Victoria, we call it our moral purpose. It's and I should say this is part of a staff culture activity that we recently did. We did have a mission and a vision and KPIs, so key performance indicators, and we made a conscious decision as the exec team to switch to a moral purpose instead of a mission and a vision, because we thought that sent the message a bit more clearly to the staff that we are, you know, a profit for purpose organisation. So we are genuinely committed to conservation, and found the, you know, mission vision language really helpful, but also a little bit corporate-y. So we wanted to switch over to a bit more of this focus on really integrating our core values around conservation. So the moral purpose is to fight extinction and create a future rich in wildlife. And the broad disciplines very relevant in this area, it's not an exhaustive list obviously, is threatened species, conservation biology, animal welfare science, and the science of behaviour change. So they all target different areas, they all have different defining features. Threatened species biology is focusing mostly on wild animals, the species level or population level, can look into ecosystem services, and is really addressing threats to biodiversity or the quantity of life. Animal welfare science is mostly focusing on captive animals, with some exceptions and a bit of a growing area of work at the moment. It's really targeted on the individual level, not sometimes the group of animals level as well, but less so on a population or species level focus. And it addresses threats to health and well-being, and very much focused on quality of life for individuals. And then the science of behaviour change, it's human psychology. We consider the theory of planned behaviour, and it's addressing threats that are in human control to change. And so thinking where we've come from in this space, so I'd say this is a bit of a reflection of the current state in general. So not necessarily in the zoo sector, but in general, how these scientific disciplines are considered at the moment. They are working a lot in isolation. So these are little brick walls, I think, that summarize the separation that is seen across these disciplines, and very little cross-pollination of ideas and discussions tend to occur in this space. Here's what I would suggest that Zoos Victoria are at. We have tried to strip down the walls and the barriers, and we've done as much as we can so far to start blending the sciences together, but we do have a long way to go still. We've targeted specifically at first, the most logical grouping was threatened species and social science. So in our most recent conservation master plan, we paired every threatened species activity with a social science campaign target, which has worked really well, but we do have much more integration to go in this space. And then animal welfare science is absolutely something that we need to start merging much more closely into our conservation work, because traditionally we've done it really focusing on zoo animals, but there's so much to be learnt if we start breaking down these barriers between these disciplines and have them working all together. And it just makes so much sense. So apologies for some of these graphic images here, I should say, but when you start thinking about the threats to wildlife that we're trying to tackle as zoo-based conservation organisations, again, another figure I do like to visually plot things on a scale and try and make sense of patterns and trends. And this one again was pretty obvious that the conservation significance of various threatening processes and the potential for animal welfare harms are pretty much, that go hand in hand. Very little conservation or threats to conservation issues don't have animal welfare impacts as well. So chytrid disease in threatening so many of our amphibians, clear animal welfare and health impacts. Same with deforestation, the potential to die of starvation or exposure. It's so many animal welfare issues with that. And then we see a lot of the key disease processes that threaten our local wildlife, like this Tasmanian devil facial tumour. Obviously not a positive welfare state to be in with that level. And then plastic pollutions for our seabirds is another key threat. And then layer onto that the human side of it. So which of these are driven predominantly by humans or influenced by humans? And again, all three of them are absolutely so interconnected. So threats that have a human-driven component to it, animal welfare issues, and can have catastrophic effects on species level and population level dynamics. And so this is why really recently, and you'll notice a lot of these, this literature is in the last few years. So Naya Boisele at Massey University has been writing about this and calling for a lot more action in this space more recently. And I love this quote from one of her papers around the growing urgency for conservation brings the need for us to work together. So animal welfare scientists and conservation scientists to start discussing how the different learnings and different lenses on which we tackle problems can actually result in some breakthroughs to how we conceptualize and do this work. And then this was another one, and again, notice it's published in Science, which is obviously one of the top tier academic journals that exist, and it calls again for conservation organisations to recognise this opportunity we have to reshape it into a discipline that promotes quantity of species and quality of animal life. And so there is a lot of discussion, a lot of theory, and a bit of a call to arms for these disciplines and scientists from each to work together to start trying to work out how we tackle some of these quite overwhelming threats and challenges that face both individual animals and population. And this is just so important for zoos to be aware of. This is not something that needs to stick within just the academic world and have scientists discuss, you know, in scientific journals or amongst themselves. This is something that practitioners like us who work in industries and on the ground in a lot of this work for zoo animals, for wildlife, and for a range of tackling a range of these issues. This is absolutely something that we should be considering in how we plan and implement this new thinking into what we do. And so we've tried hard to start to rethink our strategy and how we do things, and look again for the next transformation. And so in our 2030 strategy that we've just developed in the last couple of years, again, there's our moral purpose, still staying true to conservation, focusing on a future rich in wildlife. We have 4 focus areas. So working for wildlife, and that's my favourite language nuance there. It actually switches it to make sure it's very obvious that we are the ones working for wildlife. Wildlife, they're not working for us. We're flipping the power balance there. We're trying really hard to instill that message that we are here to serve the needs of wildlife. And so that's where a lot of this work will happen, and we'll spend the time thinking about that focus area. Then our other focus areas: connecting community with nature, thriving ethical business, with a triple S there on the end, and creating special places. So that's about our zoo properties in facilitating this work. So honing in now on working for wildlife, here's how we conceptualize some of this work and bring it together. So our vision or our goal of work in this area is to be a holistic conservation organisation, and we want to promote the quality of life for animals, the protection of biodiversity, and a positive human-nature relationship. So even in that goal and vision, we want to merge these disciplines together and not keep them separate or isolated. So then we have 4 areas within this focus area. It includes what we call our fighting extinction work, which is the really threatened species recovery work that we focus on. It's almost, we also call it the ICU of conservation. So these are some of the most critically endangered species on the planet that we are just trying to recover, to prevent extinction and ultimately recover, and to varying levels of success, but we are absolutely committed to it and in it for the long game. Then we have animals in our care. So we recognise that there's no way we could do anything successful in conservation outside our walls if we weren't taking very seriously the animals inside our zoo walls. And so that's where the absolute highest standards of animal welfare and attitude towards animals come into play. And we've also incorporated more recently in there the consideration of wildlife that comes into our hospitals, and how we make sure that they're getting the same standards of care that we deliver the zoo animals in our care. And again, the really key focus on evidence-based management there. Then we have Voice for Wildlife, and this is about us being advocates, and again, working for wildlife. What do we need to do to serve the needs of wildlife? And that means giving them a voice and raising the profile of certain issues. And this is where our social science really comes into play, in our behaviour change campaigns that we work through. And then lastly, this 4th area in the top corner, emergency wildlife response. This is a bit of an emerging area for us, and this is really about how do we take moral obligation to wildlife in our own backyards, in zoo and in the wild in our area seriously, and we need a duty of care to them, and what work can we do in that space. And so the social science is that corner. Animal welfare science is really strong in this part. Threatened species biology is key for the fighting extinction work. And then they all come together, again, to work collectively in this emergency wildlife response area. And so this is how we're going to start, I think, using this as an example of the blending of these sciences and the value that we can start to see once we do this well. And so this is we're not going to go through this in detail, but this is some of the things once we start reshaping our work in this space and how we work in conservation by blending these areas together. We really do need to start thinking about how we evaluate our research and our work in a way that we directly want to measure the impact, the outputs and the impact that is actually contributing to the change we want to see. So a lot of academics, a lot of science is based on publications and citations, for example, which is important in certain areas, but we also want to recognise and really value the importance of using what we do in these various disciplines to demonstrate benefits to animals. Even if it's one individual animal, it is worth it for us, and to focus in on the broader benefits to policy and driving positive change. And so this means shifting how we measure things again, and more specifically, really understanding some of these impact measures. So a bit more specific in this, I just wanted to use a case study to try and demonstrate some of this work and how these disciplines can work together, and how well placed zoos are around the world to contribute significantly to this growing movement. And so this is a growing field we're calling wildlife welfare. It's about actions or interventions that are designed to minimise suffering in a wild living individual. Decisions are made based on welfare outcomes for an individual, but also we do consider conservation status of a species in some decision making. And so that's relevant to certain decisions around likelihood of successful return to the wild and other biological considerations in that lens. The ethics of this space is really, really complicated and challenging to get your head around. There's a lot of deep discussions and thinking that happen around, how much human intervention is appropriate and how much should we let nature take its course. For example, is a common phrase heard, and there's no easy answer to this. We don't have the answer. It's just about having these conversations and being comfortable enough to work through them, and ask these questions of our own work as well. And then the obvious one is why would zoos get involved in this work when it's not directly addressing issues associated with animals in our duty of care. So there's some practical reasoning behind this. To do this work needs very specialist expertise for wildlife, particularly in Australia. So our native species are very obviously unique and require very specialist veterinary skills and knowledge. We need also, to be able to do it, access to housing and facilities for a range of wildlife, different species, compared to a lot more of our domestic vets that have access to various housing and special supplies for that group of animals. And it also really does need a network of support, particularly for emergency events where you need the surge housing. So access to a network of zoos, which exactly what EAZA is, working collaboratively as a really well-placed organisation to do this kind of collective work and power across numbers. And we've also got a moral obligation. So it's really important for us to consider us as an industry, our duty of care to wildlife, not only in our care, but the wildlife around us. And if we want to be genuine, skip forward, make genuine commitments to conservation and call ourselves a zoo-based conservation organisation, we can't turn our back on threats to wildlife that we see unfolding in front of us. And we found out that there is, in our recent example of bushfires threatening a lot of our native wildlife, there is really strong community expectation that experts will step up and help wildlife in these times. So quick map of Australia. Obviously we're very familiar with where everything is here, but to the rest of the world, like you guys, I just thought I'd do a quick reminder. I'm going to talk about here, Zoos Victoria. This is where we are. That's Melbourne around here, just on the bay, and our zoos are very focused around this part here in Victoria. So we're going to hone in on that little pink area here's a bigger map of Victoria. Here's where our what's called the Black Summer, the bushfires swept. To be honest, most of Australia was on fire last summer. We had prolonged drought and the perfect storm for a horrific fire season that ended up being even more horrific than we predicted. But it was categorised as one of the worst environmental catastrophes in Victoria's history because of the areas, the extent of the area that burnt and the actual areas that burnt. So you'll see on this map here, this is biodiverse hotspots where a lot of the threatened species and in some cases the last stronghold of certain populations were existing or just hanging on, and that's where the fire burnt, where those shaded areas are. And this is change in biodiversity value as a result of devastation of the environment. So a significant impact in terms of so many species that were just hanging on there, and still a body of work underway. Recovery is years and years and years in the making, but we committed and we said, yep, we're trained for this, we've got the skills, we've got the expertise, and we've got the facilities. So we put our hand up on behalf of the state to cover off on the wildlife response along with our partners, including wonderful partners like I4 and RSPCA and other groups here. And I just want to point out, I'm just going to give you a quick example of, see this little patch here, you can see the fire surrounded around here. This is Cape Howe, and that is where this little guy, the eastern bristlebird, lived. So the fires burnt down the east coast of Australia. Out of the 4 populations of this critically endangered species, Cape Howe was the last unburnt area, and the fire was surrounding it. So we couldn't sit by and watch a species go extinct. So we drew on our partners and evacuated them out of there and did an emergency extraction for the birds before the fire passed through, kept them in temporary housing at Melbourne Zoo, and then released them once the threat had passed and it was deemed safe in their habitat to return. And we've done the same with various amphibian species. These are 2 little tadpoles that came into our care as the start of the conservation breeding program for this species of giant burrowing frog. They are 80% of their last known habitat was burnt, and our researchers out in the field managed to find a couple of remnant puddles where these tadpoles were. So we got through the permitting and brought them into care. And these guys, this is an example of, again, non-threatened species. In koalas in Victoria aren't threatened. The koalas further up north in New South Wales and Queensland are different. They're categorised as a vulnerable species. So these little fellas were impacted from welfare point of view, not necessarily conservation point of view. And so we, again, didn't stand by and just watch that happen. We wanted to learn. We wanted to get in, rescue as many as we could, patch them up, get them back for health and release them. But we also wanted to build the evidence base behind this and understand welfare implications of what that intensive rehab for these animals that had horrible burns on their feet and ears, and how, going through that rehab process over several months in our care, how that made them fare in the wild. So we monitored them all, and they have little radio collars on and monitored survival and space use and how they settled back into their environment. And it's been a long road. We're actually this coming weekend taking the collars off, and it's the end of the research project for monitoring, and that information is going to be built back into our care protocols and procedures for them. And then we went, how do we do more with this work from a conservation? So the threatened species, the animal welfare, and now the social science and behaviour change. And so our social scientists worked on a campaign around summer with wildlife, and as these animals are recovering it's not just the immediate threat of the fire, it's all the other challenges that come with it in terms of lack of habitat refuge, shelters, food availability, increased risk of predation. How can us humans around these animals help support them through this recovery? And so we ran a Victoria Focus campaign for our visitors and our supporters online in what are some wildlife friendly behaviours that people can engage in to help animals through the summer period. And this was all a really interesting experience for us. We started looking into the psychology of this, and there's certain emotions that are triggered when you see images like this of this poor koala with clearly singed fur and feeling quite, I think, devastated to see that, versus when you see someone actually stepping up and helping the animals. And this empowers people and gives them a sense of comfort that there are people and experts out there working for these animals and working for wildlife. And so that message in itself is powerful, that can give people a sense of hope for these animals. And that's all embedded in how we, there's a body of science around effective altruism and the driving of people wanting to support this work, particularly through donations, and how we now know that the most effective way to trigger this empathetic response in people is to focus again on the individual animal. So this is an animal-centric focus rather than, you know, the broader. We recognise the value of the environment and the broader system, and that we're all interconnected. But most of us as humans, as a species, very social species, are triggered by this need to focus on empathy. And there was a really interesting study here by Swim and Blood Hut where they tested this and asked their survey participants what they would support more, and they had ran an experiment where they messaged climate change under the lens of climate change is harming the environment and the ecosystem versus climate change is harming this individual animal, and they found much more of a response and a intent to help and support when it was made about an individual animal. And so this is just so important for zoos to be aware of in how we communicate our conservation work. And we saw this as we were working on behalf of the state for wildlife, and so many people got behind the work, from these little kids that collected $7 of their pocket money and brought it into the sanctuary to help us work with the koalas, versus, you know, some of the big corporate supporters as well. And then we did some really interesting community perception work on us as an organisation and how did our community perceive us. And what we're looking at here is a range of these different categories around Victorians, so local Victorians, and how they saw Zoos Victoria as working in the protection of endangered species, this first column, or actions that they can take to help wildlife, the responsibility of zoos, and rehabilitating wildlife, a bit more specific. And this is so this survey is conducted by us every quarter. So this is over seasons. And the part where the bushfires hit, and then we messaged and talked to the public about the work we were doing on behalf of them, thanks to their support, is where we see these peaks. So we had much greater awareness of the work we do and the ethical responsibility of this. And this also resulted in really positive public sentiment towards zoos and Zoos Victoria, specifically as an organisation that works for wildlife and is ethical and responsible in terms of the work we do for threatened species and supporting wildlife through hardships. So that's it in a nutshell. So that's basically just I think demonstrating that it's not only the benefits to the wildlife that we can start seeing and conservation when we merge these disciplines together, but for us as an organisation and as an industry more broadly, it does have really positive social licence impact as well. There are some key learnings from the people psychology point of view and people in terms of the zoo staff. We do need to be really comfortable with shifting goalposts, because we do want to be focusing on continuous improvement and what we can do more of. And we don't have, we can set incremental benchmarks and aim towards them, but we are going to be changing the goalposts as we go. And that's actually really quite hard for some people to get their head around. So we do need to get comfortable with that. We need to be comfortable with really critical, challenging conversations that do make us reconsider even practices that we thought were great 2 years ago. We need to be open to having conversations around, are we still doing the right thing? And have we learnt more and know more now that means that we need to change what we do? We also don't have a rule book. There's so much grey area. There's some stuff that's black and white in this area, which is great, and we should deal with those as a matter of priority, but there's a whole lot of grey area as well in how we approach these things. And so we can't have a sense of really clear guidelines and a rule book. We're going to have to navigate our way through this. And the other key point is we need to be setting aspirational standards, not especially when it comes to animal welfare codes and goals and visions. Set standards that we are proud of and that we want to live by, not ones that are easy for us to achieve. And we also do want to be really, really ready to let go of some historical ideas and concepts. And so just to finish up, some key learnings or bits of advice from us on this journey is so important for us. The staff empowerment and ownership of these changes and these transformations in how we do things is so critical. So the zoo leadership absolutely need to support it and guide where needed, but it should really come from the ground staff who are the experts in delivering this stuff. So whatever we can do as zoos to support the experts and the staff on the ground to drive the change themselves, that should be a key priority. We need to value partnerships. We can't do this work alone. It's impossible, and be as collaborative and inclusive as we can. And this means not just other zoos as a partnership, but look to other industries and other relevant organisations. Invest in science is a key one. The trust in, some independent evidence-based work is so important. And I cannot stress that one enough. The investment in science and taking that seriously is so important. And looking outside of the zoo bubble as well, just exposing ourselves to new ways of thinking. Focusing on hope and giving people actions that they can take, not that, some of these devastating images of wildlife suffering is quite confronting, but you don't want to then leave people feeling so distraught that they can't do anything. Give them something that they can then act on and do to help and support them to go through that path. And then do it in a way that's exciting. Focus on the future. Don't be too concerned about all the things we're leaving behind. Just be really excited about the future and lead people in a way that makes it as part of a opportunity for driving change and positive change, not as a sad of what we're leaving behind. Just focusing on the good things to come. So that's it from me. That was a big a summary or deep dive into this area, and we've seen just so many really positive benefits, not only in our conservation gains and work and learnings as an organisation, but in our staff in terms of their satisfaction and motivation for some of the work that we do. So time for questions from now. And I know I talked a lot about the wildlife, but I hope it makes sense in terms of what we're doing to apply our knowledge and learnings from the zoo animal work to the wild, and as easily as transferable back to the zoo animals.
Thank you very much, Sally. That was absolutely fascinating, and lots of take-home messages there for us all. So we do have a good list of questions for you, if you are ready. So I would like to ask Fatika, apologies if I've pronounced that wrong, but if you could please unmute yourself.
Hi.
Hello, welcome. And thank you for your question. If you'd like to ask Sally.
Yeah, I would like to ask, but I realized that most of the question was answered when she talked about the koalas towards the end of the presentation. But my question was originally that the animals that are probably injured in the wild and are taken into zoos for rehabilitation, are they released back into the wild? And as for the koalas, like you mentioned, the non-threatened animals, they are, I'm guessing, usually given back to the wild. But I do have another layer to that question. It's that maybe is it possible that some of the animals are kept in the zoos, even if they're non-threatened, simply to educate people on their conservation? Or are they all still released back to the wild? Because in the end, zoos and aquariums, they are about tourism, right? So if they're all released back to the wild, then how are the zoos able to have enough species to actually attract visitors and tourists so that they can be in turn educated about conservation?
Yeah, good question. We as an organisation have a really strong position that we see success as animals in the wild, and that's what we all strive towards. So our rescued and rehabilitated animals, everything we do to get them back to the wild. Same with our threatened species. We don't want to have them breeding in captivity for the sake of breeding in captivity. We want to have them breeding for release to the wild. But having said that, there are so many opportunities and values for these animals to help people connect with their stories and the protection of them in the wild. But we weigh that up with consideration of their welfare. So if an animal is healthy and can't be released to the wild, for example, koalas, what we see with some of their burn injuries is such severe burns that it's called digital necrosis. They lose their claws and they can't climb successfully up the extent they need in the wild. So they might be healthy but unable to be fit for release. And so we do need to weigh up, what's best for that animal. Do we think it's going to be suitable to live in a semi-wild facility, or we need to weigh up options for potential euthanasia if we don't think that that's appropriate. But it is a really complex ethical discussion for us, and we're plotting it on some of these scales of conservation gain and animal welfare consideration is so important. But it is, we do aim for animals in the wild as much as possible, but a lot of zoo animals do play that really key role for us in telling those powerful stories. But we would only do that if we're convinced that we can give them a life where they're thriving in our care.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatika. Thank you, Sally. If I could go on to Hannah Maya, please, if you could kindly unmute yourself and ask Sally your question.
Yes, hi Sally, thank you very much. It was really interesting talk. We also have a wildlife hospital in Helsinki Zoo, and I was wondering your resources, your staff resources. Do you use volunteers? And do you get any funding from the state or the government?
Yes, yeah. Our we don't use volunteers. I don't know what it's like elsewhere, but we have very strict biosecurity processes and procedures, and disease transfer is a very real risk. So we've got we do want very skilled and specialized people working in that space. So it is heavily reliant on our staff. And funding for it is a combination. We do get support from government for certain projects and pieces of work. We also we get a lot of community support and philanthropy support for this work, and as well as seeing it as a key, part of our core duty. So we do dedicate a lot of our general zoo budget to do this work. We see it as our duty of care to wildlife in our backyard. So a bit of a combination of funding.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah Maya and Sally. And now we are over to Ord. Ord, if I could ask you to unmute yourself, please.
Hi, morning or good day, whatever, where you are in the world. Thank you for a very inspirational talk, Sally, and for your time. I was wondering, because we often hear a lot about Australian zoos being involved in the conservation of their national species. And I was wondering, because it's not that clear in France, where I live, or even within Europe. And I was wondering if you think we could use the same principles, the same model for a wider area, like I'm thinking European mink or a lot of reptiles that are currently critically endangered in Europe. And what are your thoughts about it?
Yeah. It's a really good point. It was a conscious strategic move that we made 10 years ago to focus on local Victorian wildlife. So not only Australian wildlife, we do work with a few species interstate, but the critically endangered animals in Victoria, of which there is unfortunately a very long list. And we thought, what if every zoo around the world looked after these critically endangered species just, at our own back door, then imagine how much better biodiversity would be, because we are, I think zoos just don't get enough credit for the extent of expertise and skill and knowledge that exists in our organisations. And so if we put that to this kind of use and work together as a big network of really skilled professionals, and strategically focused on animals in our own backyard, but also connecting across this broader network. The biodiversity gain is just so exciting to think about in how we could transform that and legitimize a lot of the effort in conservation. So I think it's a conscious strategy zoos need to do. It's not the most charismatic species. Often we call them little brown things here in Victoria. They're tiny. Most of the species you can't see. They're nocturnal. We have no idea even of their most basic behaviour, because a lot of them are burrowing or up in the mountains or just completely unknown. We find them fascinating and amazing, but it's not like working with orangutans and tigers and the big exciting things. So we do see that we need to it is a trade-off. It is harder to connect people with the bawbaw frog than it is an orangutan, but there's ways we can do it. And once you start crossing species off the threatened species list, like we're about to for eastern bio bandicoot, it is just the best feeling. And so if zoos around the world took that approach, it would just be amazing.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Thank you, Sally. And if I could hand over to Thomas, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Sally. It was a nice and interesting talk. I really like the fact how you conceptualize the history of zoos, and I do think you more looked at it from a what and a how perspective, and not really from the why, because ultimately the how and the what are a result of your purpose. What are you doing? So I would really like to see how that developed in history as well, and also how the future may look like. But actually that was not really my question. Often when I talk to zoo people, then they say, well, we try to keep our animals as good as possible or as natural as possible, and these are often intermixed in a similar way, but for me there are two total different ways of keeping animals. So I was wondering what your perspective on that is, and if you also if it influences the way you keep your animals, for example, based on the conservation status, or whether these are rescued animals or they're part of a breeding program.
Yes, absolutely. It's we do house them in different areas, different settings, according to their them as individuals and what their future and whole of life care looks like. So those that are part of our conservation breeding programs, we do want to minimize human exposure and contact, and so they're in very different parts of the zoo that visitors don't often get near. And then those, some of those animals that are retired, breeding animals that aren't fit for release, just needing to live out their life, they sometimes then move to areas that are where visitors are, but we monitor and manage them very carefully to make sure that they're adjusting well. But it's a lot of our threatened species don't necessarily make very great zoo display animals. It's everything here is small, brown, nocturnal, and hides a lot, very, very secretive. But yeah, so it is a very individual approach to how we house and display animals according to what their future needs are going to be, as well as their current needs as individuals. So it's a real case by case decision making process.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sally. And that brings us to the end of our webinar. So a very, very, very big thank you to everyone for joining us today, and thank you for your continued support for the EAZA Animal Welfare webinars. We really did hope you find them useful, and that was a brilliant talk, Sally. Thank you very, very much. I'd like to extend my thanks also to the International Fund for Animal Welfare for sponsoring these webinars and making them possible, and obviously a huge thank you to you, Sally, for taking your time and expertise to join us today. I said lots and lots of take-home messages there for us, and I think certainly in the zoo world we do all acknowledge the work that zoos Victorian, EAZA for example, are doing, and there's lots of things that we can learn from your example, so thank you for sharing it with us. Our next webinar is to be confirmed, so please keep an eye on EAZA's social media channels and our website, and hopefully we'll release that title and date for you in the next couple of days. And keep an eye out for the recording of this webinar, which please do download and share and spread the word. We do welcome and encourage you to do that. And we also have a save the date for you for EAZA's first non-virtual EAZA Animal Welfare Forum. Hopefully, fingers crossed, it's going to be in person, live. That is on the 22nd to the 24th of March 2022, so pretty much this time next year. And we just heard from Thomas Beyonder from Appenhall asking the last question there, so he's coordinating and hosting it at Appenhall. So please do save those dates. We'll be opening registration and call for abstracts further on in the year. So hopefully we'll all see you there as well. So thank you very much. My final thank you to you, Sally, and thank you to everyone for joining us. Bye.
Thanks for having me.